Hello and welcome. This is going to be the fourth video on the Four Noble Truths, the one where we discuss the fourth noble truth. In our last video, we discussed the third noble truth, which is the truth of the cessation of suffering through the cessation of craving. We saw how our sense of suffering or unsatisfactoriness in life was due to cravings, the cravings that we have. In particular, the way that we crave for the permanence of those things that we find pleasurable in life, and we crave for the permanent extinction of those things that we find painful or unpleasurable in life. And we saw how those cravings that we have, these tend to essentially be kinds of addictions that pull us this way and that don't give us any respite, if you like, that steer our lives in ways that are not most beneficial to us in the long term. And so that getting out from under them can give us a real sense of true freedom if we can find a way to cease such cravings, and therefore, in ceasing such cravings, cease the unsatisfactoriness that these cravings cause. Because most people live their lives essentially going from one craving to the next. But what I think we should be wondering about, and what the subject of this video is, what we should wonder about is, what is the proper practice that leads to the cessation of suffering through the cessation of craving? Well, that is the subject of the fourth noble truth, which is the truth of what's called the magga, or the path. That is the path that leads to the cessation of suffering through the cessation of craving. So this is a path that basically helps us undermine our cravings in such a way that they begin to disappear. And once they disappear, the suffering that those cravings cause also tends to disappear and abate. So, as in the past three lectures, what we're going to do is to look at what the Buddha had to say about this fourth noble truth in his supposed first sermon, how he defined it there. And then we'll go through what he had to say, sort of phrase by phrase, to try to unpack what is, in fact, a very dense kind of description. So, what the Buddha said is, "Now this is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is this noble eightfold path. That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration." Now here, I have to pause for a second just to point out something that I find very beautiful in the way the Buddha describes this. Because here we can see the kind of recursive nature of the Buddha's teachings, in the sense that the fourth noble truth includes the Eightfold Path. That is to say, in the fourth noble truth, the Buddha explains or posits the Eightfold Path as exemplifying that truth. However, when we look at the Eightfold Path by itself, which we can do and will do other places, well, the first stage in the Eightfold Path is right view, as the Buddha described it here. Right view is ordinarily understood in its deeper sense to be a view of the Four Noble Truths themselves. So in this sense, the Eightfold Path encompasses the Noble Truths. They're part of the path. And the Four Noble Truths encompass the Eightfold Path. So that this is one of the ways that where, no matter where we enter into the Buddhist Dharma, we can find all parts of it by looking around. They all sort of encompass each other. But having said that, what we want to know then is, what is the Eightfold Path and how does it lead to the extinction of suffering through craving, through the extinction of craving? Now, so what I'm going to do here is to give a short overview of the Eightfold Path. I should say that I have a longer course, actually a whole course on the Eightfold Path over at the Online Dharma Institute. It's called Ascent Towards Freedom, the Eightfold Spiral Path, where I look at the path at different levels of understanding and different levels of our depth to which we come to that path, because the path is something that we can come back to again and again in our practice. It's not a static thing, but rather something that changes depending on where we are. So in any event, what I want to do is to give a short overview of the path here. And the path is generally understood to have three different aspects: ethics, meditation, and wisdom. When it comes to ethics, there are 3 parts to the path that fulfill the ethical part. There's right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And basically all of these are practices that we undertake to minimize the suffering or damage or difficulties we give to other people. We want to minimize harm, basically. Minimize harm in our speech so that we don't speak harmfully, we don't lie, we don't speak divisively or harshly. We want to minimize our harm in our behavior so that we don't kill, we don't steal, and so on. We don't commit sexual misconduct. And we want to minimize harm in our livelihood because we, after all, are lay people. I assume you're a lay person, you have a livelihood. So in your livelihood, the way that you make your income, you want to do it with as little harm as possible. So that's the ethical part of the path. Next, we come to the part of the path having to do with meditation. And these involve right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And these are ways that we attempt to basically purify the mind, that we attempt to calm the mind down in such a way that we can see it more clearly. By calming the mind down, that purifies it to a degree because we're no longer agitated, stressed, the mind is no longer in turmoil. But having done that calming, then we want to look at it mindfully. That is to say, to see what's there, to see how we react to things, to see what parts of the world make our mind more skillful, and what parts of our behavior or our experience make our mind unskillful in certain ways. And how do we deal with these? What kinds of techniques can we use? These are all parts of what we might call the meditative aspect of practice. And finally, the third aspect of the path is the wisdom aspect, which involves right view and right intention. And here is where we make an attempt, we try to come to a wise understanding of the way the world works, to a wise understanding of the fact that all things change, that all things appear to us unsatisfactory in certain respects. We come to an experience of that, as we've seen in the First Noble Truth already. We come to an awareness of non-self, that wherever we look, we don't find a permanent sense of self or a permanent self anywhere. And we come to an understanding that there's a difference between the skillful and the unskillful, that there are skillful ways of thinking and acting in the world, and there are unskillful ways of doing the same. And so we make an intention to pursue the skillful as so far as we can, and to avoid the unskillful. Now, these recommendations along the Eightfold Path are very simple and direct. They're very down to earth. They're the kinds of things that I think are very understandable to all of us. But that said, they're simple, but they're not easy. They take true dedication and consistent practice over long periods of time to have any real effect. So this is a path to pursue as they say, as a marathon rather than as a sprint. The sort of thing that you pursue over months, years, and decades, over lifetimes, or a lifetime anyhow. Not the sort of thing you can expect to pursue over a week or a long weekend and find any real results. The second question we may have is how this Eightfold Path leads to an extinction of suffering through the extinction of craving. And this is an enormous topic, but I'll try to sketch out some of my thoughts here. First of all, it helps to extinguish craving by recommending practices of non-harming. In so doing, it's limiting the amount of hatred there is in the world. It's basically causing us to pay attention to our own anger and hatred, the way that we display that to the world through our speech and actions. But by limiting the amount of damage, of harm that we do to others, it also is going to minimize the amount of anger and hatred they have towards us, or they have in general. Anger and hatred are particularly strong forms of craving that indeed produce cravings in others. So When we have, let's say, hatred, that's a craving that somebody else suffer, for example, or somebody else have something bad happen to them. If we act out on that in such a way to cause someone to suffer, that's going to cause to arise in them a similar anger. Indeed, perhaps even in people who were close to them. Their family and friends may feel similar anger to them when they reflect upon the fact that their friend or family member has been injured. So when we minimize the amount of harm we're doing in the world, we're minimizing the amount of hatred there is out there. And that is a start. And then also we have practices of calming on their own, which also tend to decrease the amount of craving there is in ourselves, because as we calm down the mind, as we do practices that calm the mind, those naturally tend to at least modestly decrease the amount of craving that we feel from moment to moment. And as we become more mindful through our practice, we begin to see our cravings as less skillful. We begin to see the harm in them, not only in their outward function in the world, but also we begin to see the cravings themselves as less pleasurable and indeed as more painful. We begin to see cravings as themselves expressions of suffering. And as such, as being not the sort of things to look after, not the sorts of things to try to cultivate. And as we begin to see these cravings also as displaying examples of unsatisfactoriness and unskillfulness, we begin to give them up. That is to say, we see them deeply as unskillful in many respects, and seeing them in that way causes their power over us to decrease, causes them to have less of a hold over us, because we've sort of seen through them. We've seen the problems in them. We've seen the difficulties in them. So, for example, at one point earlier on in my practice, or even before my practice, when I would read somebody saying something false on the internet, I would have a craving to correct them in some kind of an overtly nasty way, let's say. Over time, that craving of mine, I began to see as not only unskillful, but as painful, as suffering, and as causing more suffering, not only in others, but in myself. And as I began to see that, the craving to do that declined. Similarly, we can find ourselves craving things, let's say craving buying something in a store. And we may go out on weekends at one point and just as a matter of course, go from store to store looking for things to buy. That's a common way that many of us find to sort of blow off steam or let off stress. What is it called? Retail therapy. But as we practice further, we begin to see the roots of that in unsatisfactoriness, in this sense that we can somehow become better or healthier or happier by buying things. And as we see those expressing examples of unsatisfactoriness and suffering, we see the example of buying being itself suffering. And indeed, as a result, our tendency to want to buy things just to buy them tends to dry up over time. It tends to have less of an effect on us. Not to say we won't buy things, but it's just that we'll be a little bit more careful about them because the mere desire to purchase has less of a control over us. So this is the way, essentially, this is the process by which practice can cause our cravings to decrease and therefore our suffering or our unsatisfactoriness to decrease. As some psychologists have said, basically what it does is to open up a space between the stimulus of the outside world and our response to it. One of the very famous psychologists named Viktor Frankl, again, very famously had this to say about the stimulus and the response. He said, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." The problem is that space between stimulus and response, for many of us, and for us perhaps most of our lives, is so narrow that we can't even see it. We react instinctually to any kind of a response, or I should say to any kind of a stimulus. So if a stimulus is negative, we react instinctually with anger or hatred. We don't give ourselves that space. And similarly, if a stimulus is attractive, we immediately, let's say, want to purchase it. There's no space there for us to think. And what practice does over time, again, over long periods of time, is to open up a little bit of space there, to give us a little bit of time. It won't always work, and with particularly powerful stimuli, the space may close up again, but at least in many respects, we're giving ourselves more breathing room here. And as with each of these Four Noble Truths, the Fourth Noble Truth also has a task associated with it that the Buddha described in his first sermon. And what is the task of the Fourth Noble Truth? That is, the task of the Fourth Noble Truth is one of development. As the Buddha says, this noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering is to be developed. That is, it's to be cultivated, just the way we might cultivate a plot of land by hoeing it and watering the plants that we plant in the soil there, and over a period of time reap the rewards. It's a long-term practice. It's not the sort of thing, this cultivation, this development, again, is not the sort of thing that we should expect to happen quickly. It happens over a long period of time. But that, in general, is our practice. Now, one question that we may have has to do with this whole idea of craving that we discussed earlier. That is, we said that one of the things we ordinarily do in life is to crave the permanency of those things that we find pleasurable, and the permanent extinction of those things that we find painful or suffering. Well, one might say, isn't this whole practice a practice of just that, of craving of a certain kind? We're craving the eternal or the permanent cessation of suffering itself. And so therefore, isn't this entire path a path that is led on by a kind of craving? And if so, is that a problem? Is that a sort of a way that the path undermines itself? And this is a very deep kind of question, and it's a question that many people have had over the centuries and millennia of Buddhism, but it's a question that actually has an answer in the early Buddhist texts. And I actually did a past video trying to give the answer to that question from these early Buddhist texts, and I'll leave a link to that up on the screen if you want to see more. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page and considering joining us and helping out the channel. Thanks so much to all my patrons, and thanks to you for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.